The company pleaded guilty to 84 counts of involuntary manslaughter. At 6:15 a.m. on November 8, 2018, a 100-year-old metal hook on a Pacific gas and electric transmission line failed. The energized conductor dropped and struck dry November brush in the hills above Paradise, California. Within minutes, a fire moved through the canyon. Within hours, it had swept through Paradise at a speed that gave residents minutes, not hours, to get out. By the time firefighters contained the blaze, 85 people were dead, 18,804 structures had burned, and a town of 27,000 no longer existed. PG&E had flagged that transmission line as aging equipment requiring maintenance. They had assessed the hook. They had deferred the repair. The hook failed on the schedule that deferred maintenance creates. Paradise sat in the low Sierra foothills northeast of Sacramento, a town shaped by long winters and dry summers, by the rhythm of retirees who moved there for the quieter life. Its narrow streets, pines, and ranch-style houses created an air of permanence. On that November morning, permanence dissolved into chaos. The fire spread faster than predictions and faster than the routes out could accommodate. Highways choked with stalled vehicles. People abandoned cars and fled on foot. Many who died were elderly, overcome attempting to escape from places they had called home for decades. The town's geography, steep canyons and limited exits turned routine evacuation into a nightmare of gridlock and smoke. By nightfall, what remained of Paradise was ashes and the scattered memories of those who had lived there. Investigators traced the ignition point with precision. The Carabobo-Palermo transmission line, a high-voltage artery in PG&E's northern system, revealed the locus of failure, a hook and bracket connection on a tower in Butte County. The hook was roughly a century old. At 6:15 a.m., the hook failed, sending the conductor down into tinder-dry vegetation. This was not an act of nature like lightning, nor was it human arson at the point of ignition. It was infrastructure that had reached the end of its usable life while still carrying full electrical load across a landscape primed for combustion. The element had been flagged in internal records as requiring attention. The decision at some managerial level to postpone that work set the conditions for catastrophe. Internal PG&E records recovered in legal proceedings present a consistent pattern. The utility maintained systems to flag and prioritize aging components, inspection cycles, maintenance schedules, asset lists. The Carabobo-Palermo line appeared on those lists, but the records also document a pattern of deferred action. Components marked as needing repair were scheduled and rescheduled. Budgets, staffing decisions, and corporate priorities influenced what got fixed and what got pushed down the list. Deferred maintenance saved short-term costs and bolstered quarterly results. Those same decisions allowed hardware to degrade in place under tension and weather across one of the most fire-prone service territories in the country. The Camp Fire did not happen in a vacuum. PG&E equipment had been implicated, confirmed or probable in multiple earlier wildfires. The Tubbs Fire in 2017, which killed 22 people, prompted initial suspicion of utility equipment before investigators attributed that blaze to a private electrical system. Other incidents did point to PG&E hardware as either the cause or a significant factor. Regulators issued fines and alerts. Still, the broader maintenance regime did not fundamentally change. Fire seasons intensified, vegetation grew drier, infrastructure continued to age. That combination of deteriorating hardware and escalating environmental risk would prove lethal when the right component failed at the wrong time. In June 2020, facing the legal aftermath of the Camp Fire, PG&E entered a plea that became the largest criminal conviction of a utility for wildfire deaths in California history. The company pleaded guilty in Butte County Superior Court to 84 counts of involuntary manslaughter, 1 count for each victim identified at the time, and 1 count of unlawfully causing a fire. The criminal statutes carried a maximum combined fine of $3,500,000. PG&E paid the maximum. The plea embodied a stark numerical dissonance. 84 counts, $3,500,000. The civil settlements that followed swelled into the billions, but the criminal sentence remained limited to that statutory maximum. No individual executive faced criminal charges in connection with the Camp Fire. No CEO, no operations manager, no senior engineer stood in a criminal courtroom accused of causing those deaths. At the time of the fire, PG&E's chief executive recorded total compensation for 2018 reported at approximately $14 million. The company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in January 2019, citing potentially crippling liabilities from wildfire claims. Legal scholars and observers debated at the time whether the bankruptcy filing was an unavoidable step or a strategic maneuver to constrain exposure. Ultimately, the company negotiated a civil settlement of roughly $13.5 billion with wildfire victims and creditors, and it emerged from bankruptcy in 2020. The corporate entity paid the fines and the settlements. The people whose decisions and oversight created the conditions for failure remained largely outside the reach of criminal law. After emerging from bankruptcy, PG&E resumed operation of much of California's electrical system under enhanced regulatory oversight. New requirements included installing weather monitoring stations, increasing inspection frequency. Those measures reflected lessons learned, more data, more eyes on equipment, and a willingness to cut power preemptively when conditions warranted. The Public Safety Power Shutoff Program, which intentionally de-energizes large areas to reduce the risk of equipment-caused ignitions during dangerous winds, became an operational reality for millions. Families lost power for days at a time. Hospitals and assisted living facilities enacted contingency plans. Economies of small towns slowed. Residents began to accept temporary blackouts as part of living inside a system that had once burned a town to the ground. But the reforms did not alter a foundational fact. PG&E remains a privately owned utility operating aging infrastructure across a landscape where megafires have become a predictable hazard. Enhanced oversight tightened the rules around maintenance and monitoring, but the utility model itself, a corporate entity responsible to shareholders while providing an essential public service across varied terrain, did not change. The Public Safety Power Shutoff Program, in practice, shifted a portion of the risk management burden from the utility's hardware to the people who live under its lines. In threatening weather, residents must plan for prolonged outages, secure alternate power or medical accommodations, and accept recurring interruptions to daily life. Those burdens fall disproportionately on the elderly, the medically dependent, and those with limited resources, precisely the populations most vulnerable during a fast-moving disaster. The criminal plea and the civil settlements closed one set of legal questions, but they left other questions unresolved. The largest corporate conviction of its kind did not produce individual criminal accountability. The statutory penalties for corporate criminal liability, constrained as they are, translated into a modest criminal fine for a catastrophe of enormous human and material cost. The civil settlements provided compensation to many victims and creditors, but monetary restitution cannot repair community fabric or replace lives. The bankruptcy process redistributed financial responsibility and allowed the corporation to reorganize and continue operations rather than dissolve. For some observers, the outcome raised uncomfortable questions about whether large utilities are effectively insulated from the personal accountability that individual citizens face under the law. The human record of that day remains stark and specific. Names, dates, and places are not abstract. They map to households, to kitchen tables and car keys, to dogs left behind and photographs lost in flames. Emergency calls, radio chatter, and the testimony of evacuees documented the rapid collapse of normal life in paradise. First responders described scenes of people attempting to flee through smoke and heat with little warning, confronting blocked roads and collapsing structures. Photographs from the perimeter show neighborhoods reduced to foundations and chimneys. The landscape that once framed the town, the oaks and pines in Chaparral, became a blackened silhouette against a winter sky. Those images persist in public records and in the memories of survivors. The regulatory aftermath involved a mixture of policy change and practical adaptation. State agencies increased scrutiny of utility practices and required more robust reporting. Emergency response protocols were revised. Funding mechanisms for wildfire mitigation and power system hardening were proposed and partially implemented. Vegetation management programs targeted infrastructure upgrades and selective undergrounding of lines in high-risk areas. Yet many of those measures are costly and slow, replacing tens of thousands of miles of legacy lines, retrofitting towers and appliances, upgrading monitoring systems. These are multi-year, expensive endeavors. In the interim, Communities continue to live with the dual reality of infrastructure that can ignite and protocols that sometimes require preemptive deprivation of electricity to reduce that risk. Accountability, as it operates in public life, is complex and layered. Criminal law targets individual culpability and corporate wrongdoing within statutory confines. Civil law compensates victims and allocates financial responsibility. Regulatory law adjusts future behavior through oversight and compliance. In the case of the Camp Fire, those systems intersected unevenly. A corporation admitted criminal responsibility and paid criminal and civil penalties. Regulators imposed new obligations. But the people inside corporate hierarchies who oversaw decisions about maintenance, staffing, and budgeting did not face criminal liability. The local populations who bore the consequences, those who lost homes, livelihoods, or lives, continued to navigate recovery, while the company restructured and recommenced service at scale. The technical and institutional pathways that led to the Camp Fire are now better documented than they were before. Inspection logs, maintenance schedules, internal emails, and court filings reveal a chain of decisions and omissions. Yet documentation alone does not deliver reparative justice.
Legal settlements and fines address certain harms, but they do not produce the kind of individual accountability that many victims and advocates sought. The system produced a corporate admission of criminal responsibility and a criminal fine that, measured against the scale of loss, feels disproportionately small.
The company that pleaded guilty to 84 counts of involuntary manslaughter continues to operate and to bill its customers. The Public Safety Power Shutoff program places practical burdens on communities, while it reduces one category of risk. The core tension remains between maintaining an essential service and preventing the infrastructure of that service from becoming an instrument of devastation. On the list of specific facts that the public can verify, the failed hook on the Caribou-Palermo line, the time of failure at 6:15 a.m., the number of victims recorded in the criminal plea, and the fines imposed. Those points anchor a larger story about how corporate decision-making, regulatory frameworks, and environmental conditions combine to produce an avoidable catastrophe. They also illustrate how systems respond under pressure, by criminal plea, by civil settlement, by regulatory change, and by operational practices like power shutoffs. Each response mitigates some risk and exposes other vulnerabilities. 85 people died on November 8, 2018. Their names are part of the public record of the Camp Fire. The hook that failed is part of the public record of PG&E's maintenance history. The gap between those two facts, between aging equipment and the people who died when it gave way, is a measure of what the system permitted and what it cost. PG&E pleaded guilty to 84 counts of involuntary manslaughter. The criminal fine was $3,500,000. No individual was charged. The company runs California's power grid today. The hook on the Caribou-Palermo line failed at 6:15 in the morning. By nightfall, a town was gone. Subscribe to Case Files TV, because when a company profits while its infrastructure kills, the people who died deserve more than a fine.